I am pleased that your president and your association have invited me to address you on the 46th anniversary of our republic, even though I would prefer to see the evolution of our political independent life beginning from 1962. In this context, I would also like to pay my respects to His Excellency Brigadier General Anthony W.J. Phillips Spencer, Ambassador Extraordinaire at the Embassy of Washington, D.C. What I'm sure that your President, Mr. Nigel Scott, did not tell you is that in 1962, both of us were invited by Dr. Eric Williams, Premier of Trinidad and Tobago at the time, to attend a 3-day meeting at Queen's Hall, Port of Spain, to discuss a draft of the first independent constitution. The meeting took place from April 25th to 27th, 1962. The invitation read in part, quote, "Cabinet ministers and the constitutional advisors to the cabinet will be in attendance. There will be no public opening. The discussion will be held in private and the meeting will be open only to persons who have been invited to attend either as citizens who sent in memoranda or as representatives named by organizations which did so." That's so. In those days, your president and I were very active in every community organization in our district of Tagarigua, and so it fell upon us to make our contributions on behalf of our fellow districters. I don't quite remember what we said there, but I do know that we, like most of our fellow citizens, were very heady about the possibility that we were becoming an independent nation, hopefully to create what the mighty Sparrow described as Independence Calypso tent, a model nation at last. Looking back over the years, it is not difficult to evaluate what we have achieved as a nation over the last 60 years if we compare our achievements with what we called at the time the mother country, and who it is said had the power, authority to quote-unquote grant us our independence. Last Thursday, Manuchi Shakif, director of the London School of Economics and Political Science, wrote the following about the mother country in the Financial Times. He said, and I quote, "The United Kingdom economy has two urgent problems. The first is a cost of living crisis fueled by dramatic shifts in the supply and demand for goods, particularly energy," and let me repeat again, particularly energy in a time of war, plague, and other disruptions. The second is more than a decade of low growth and productivity, or what the economy of 2030 inquiry calls, quote, stagnation nation. With the highest inflation rate in the G7, growth in labor productivity well below the OECD average, staggering real wages since 2010, and a host of other terrible economic indicators, it is no surprise that the Bank of England projects British households are facing its biggest collapse in living standards since such records were kept 60 years ago. Contrast that with what happened in our country last week. Last Monday, the Finance Minister, Colm Embert, delivered his 2023 budget speech in the House of Representatives. Trinidad Newsday reported as follows, quote, "Imber expected the earnings of to $56.175 billion and spending of $57.685 billion. On a predicted global oil price of US $90.50 and gas prices of US 6.00 MMBTU, he anticipated, a 25 billion in energy revenues and $30 billion in non-energy and $1 billion in capital revenue. He said TNT's finances were improving with US $4 billion balance of payments, US $6.8 billion in reserves, and debt to GDP at 70%. That was written in the news today, September 29th. Now, I don't mean to suggest that Trinidad and Tobago is richer than London or even as powerful as the UK. But I suspect, in qualitative terms, that compared with the present economic situation in which the UK finds itself, we are not doing too badly after 46 years of Republican status. And this is the point. We haven't done badly as a nation over the past 60 years. We have made a huge impression on the world stage in terms of academic and sports and even our carnival, and have been able to spread our carnival loving ways to many societies, Europe, Canada, United States, etc. We have also done very well in harvesting our energy resources, which today is particularly key to development, even if we know it's a drying resource. However, in light of our ability to garner our resources, there has been significant growth in our per capita income. For example, in 1962, Trinidad and Tobago's GDP was about US $948. Today, as a result of several tactical investments in the hydrocarbon sector, together with the fortuitous rise in energy prices, TNT enjoys a GDP of US $15,696 and a much higher standard of living than when we became a republic, I think is in 1976. In fact, the United Nations Human Development Report of 2021 has placed us, quote unquote, in the high human development category, positioning the country a 67 out of 189 countries and territories. That's not too bad. In 2005, the same organization ranked us 57 out of 177 countries and placed us, quote unquote, in the highest designation for countries whose life expectancy and adult literacy placed us in the top tier of countries in the world. Needless to say, the pandemic of 2 years ago has thrown us back on our heels and lower our ranking in this regard. And it's quite true, there's much more that we can do with regards to health and how we treat those people who come to our hospitals. Another indicator of our achievement has to do with how well we have preserved our democracy, particularly in the area of the peaceful transition from one government to another. Since our independence in 1962, we have witnessed the peaceful transition of governments, although there have been two unsuccessful coup attempts. In the early years of our republic, we could have taken those achievements for granted. But in the age of Donald Trump, we can no longer take these elemental aspects of democracy for granted. So that even compared with the great United States of America, we held our own in terms of the preservation of our democracy. It is one of the things which we can be most proud and should be very proud of and needs to strengthen and deepen as we go along. Trinidad and Tobago, in terms of the interracial aspect of our society after those 60 and 46 years respectively, is perhaps one of the most cosmopolitan countries in the world. As early as 1866, William Gamble, in his book Trinidad, identified the various African ethnic groups in the islands, that is, the Yorubas, the Igbos, and the Congos, and differentiated the languages spoken by Indo-Trinidadians at the time, that is, the Bengalis who spoke and speak Hindi, and the Madrasi Indians who spoke Tamil. I knew them because they were Madrasi in our village. Apart from the languages of the Portuguese and the Chinese, Gamble noted, Danes and Germans, Spanish and Italian, Scotch and Irish, French and English are to be found in our small country. That is as early as 1866. In fact, you know this very famous book by J.J. Thomas, Theory of Creole Grammar, was written in 1869 as we transitioned from the patois to the question of English. In spite of such diversity, we have stuck together as one people and as one nation, which is why in our national anthem we assert, here every creed and race find an equal place, and implore that, quote, God bless our nation. Perhaps the most notable feature of the last 156 years is the manner in which the various groups in TNT have continued to live harmoniously together, and God hope that we continue to do that. However, that is a notable achievement, particularly in what we see happening today, where just today we saw Mr. Putin move into Ukraine and said, give me that Scot. Took a fifth of the island, and of course is now prepared to defend it. Of course, it has not all been peace and love and achievements. My dear friend, Dr. Brian Harry, has defined them as matters requiring our attention. As I said, there have been shortcomings over the last 60 years. And my colleague and friend, Dr. Brian Harry, has defined them as matters requiring our attention. He lists them as, quote unquote, education reform. We still cling to the colonial ways of doing things and prize formal education above everything else. If you got a degree, you're good. Everybody else, stand back. Second, legal and judicial reform. It takes too long to pass out justice. And of course, somebody could be there in the barracks or in the whatever for 10 years before he or she gets a trial. Next shortcoming, healthcare. Too many people die from medical negligence and of course, pure indifference among some of our medical staff. Next area of shortcomings, infrastructure reform. The need, of course, to modernize the water, electricity, and transportation sector, which, of course, we know affects poor people the most. Also, the question of archaic planning mechanisms. We need to be planning year-round, guided by a future-backed position that informs our decisions in terms of where we see ourselves in 10 years hence. And of course, most importantly, he would argue, poor governance and the weakening of public institutions. If we have anything else, we have to be careful that those institutions are strengthened and kept together. Dr. Harry insists that it's imperative that we reform our infrastructure since it's the only way we pass on wealth to the poorer classes. And God knows they're suffering, and we know they're the ones who suffer most in our society. While we may enjoy a high per capita income, it does not mean that our wealth is distributed equally, nor are the poor protected from mental and physical wounds of an unjust and an unequal society. And here's where we have to probe more thoroughly to find out how just and moral our society is to all of its members. In my view, though, the most obvious shortcoming of our 60 years of independence and 46 years of republicanism has been the escalation of crime in our society. This is the greatest threat to our democracy. The ability to protect a citizen and his or her ability to feel safe in his or her society or his or her village is the hallmark of democracy in any country. If we don't control the violence that is unleashed against our citizens, primarily by the growing amount of gangs in our society, we are heading towards becoming another Haiti where gang rules the roost and the citizens take the hindmost. When your president, Mr. Nigel Scott, and I were growing up in Tagarigua in those high-school days of yore, we went for walks with our girlfriends, hung out with our friends, walked in the moonlight, and went to midnight services at our church, St. Mary's Anglican. Our fellow districtors cannot do that anymore today. In many instances, the society has become a jungle, approaching the point that Darwinian evolution theorists describe in some ways as the survival of the fittest, or what we in TNT call a dog-eat-dog society. So while we may have achieved much materially over the last 60 years, I suspect we have lost much in terms of the ability to enjoy the sanctity of our homes and just be able to free up in our own social environment. Those of us living abroad should try to do as much as possible to help to raise the social and cultural standards of our people, without which the future well-being of sweet TNT may not be as felicitous as we'd like to see it. The time for action is now. It certainly can and must begin with a discussion of our strengths and our weaknesses, seeking primarily to understand how, in spite of our best intentions, the rampant crime in our society can doom us to a failed republic. There's much more to do. We have achieved a lot, but we must keep on struggling to make our society the kind of place where every race and creed can find an equal place, and where we always try to give the best that we can in every way that we can. And this is why I've been so happy to have been invited to say a few words. I hope that you enjoyed your day, even though I know it's a bit late to say Happy Republic Day. Thank you for listening to me.